Laziness doesn't exist. That's not motivational talk, that's observable fact. What you call laziness is just energy distributed differently than you wish it were. You scroll for 3 hours, that takes energy. You overthink a conversation for days, that burns calories. You avoid a task by doing 17 other tasks, that's effort, just misdirected. The real problem isn't that you're lazy, it's that you were never taught the one principle that makes sustained action possible. And without this principle, every attempt at discipline becomes a war you fight with yourself. A war you'll eventually lose, because you can't sustain effort when effort feels like violence against your own nature. Miyamoto Musashi understood this at a level most people never reach. The legendary swordsman who fought over 60 duels without a single defeat didn't win because he was more disciplined than his opponents. He won because he understood something they didn't, something that transformed the entire experience of action. Most people think discipline is about forcing yourself to do what you don't want to do. That's why most people fail, because force creates resistance, and resistance creates exhaustion, and exhaustion creates collapse. The cycle is inevitable once you've set it in motion. But there's a different way. One that doesn't require force. One that makes action feel effortless, not because it's easy, but because it's aligned with a principle so fundamental that fighting it becomes impossible. And once you understand this principle, you'll realize you were never lazy. You were just operating without the one piece of information that makes everything else work. Before I show you how this system operates, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment. What task do you avoid most consistently, and what story do you tell yourself about why you haven't done it yet? The story I'm about to tell you happened to Marcus. He was 36 years old, worked in enterprise software sales for a company in Chicago, 12 years in the industry, solid track record, made decent money when he closed deals. Good enough to maintain the lifestyle he'd built. Downtown apartment, lease on a German sedan, dinners at restaurants that required reservations. But Marcus had a problem that was slowly destroying his career. He couldn't sustain anything. He'd have explosive months where he'd crush his quota, work 18-hour days, close massive deals. Then he'd collapse. 3 weeks of barely functioning, missed calls, ignored emails, opportunities that died because he couldn't follow up. His manager called it feast or famine. Marcus called it something else when he was alone, pathetic, because the pattern was undeniable. He wasn't incapable of work. He'd proven that repeatedly. He could do extraordinary things for short bursts, but he couldn't maintain ordinary consistency for long periods. And in sales, consistency compounds. The steady performer who shows up every day destroys the brilliant sprinter who disappears for weeks at a time. Marcus knew this. He'd read every productivity book, tried every system, time blocking, Pomodoro technique, habit stacking, accountability partners, morning routines, evening reviews. All of it worked for a while, then stopped working. Then he'd abandon it and feel worse than before he started. His colleagues mocked him for it. Not cruelly, just the casual way people mock someone who's always starting a new system. "What's the new Marcus plan this month?" someone would ask during team meetings. Everyone would laugh. Marcus would laugh too. But inside he was drowning, because he genuinely didn't understand what was wrong with him. Why couldn't he just be consistent? Why was something that seemed so simple for others completely impossible for him? The collapse came on a Monday in November. Marcus was sitting in a quarterly review with his manager, Diane. She pulled up his numbers for the year. The graph looked like a heart monitor during cardiac arrest. Massive spikes followed by flat lines. 1 month at 180% of quota, next month at 40%, back up to 150%, down to 25%. "Marcus, what am I looking at here?" Inconsistency. That's putting it mildly. You're either the best performer on the team or the worst. Nothing in between, and I need to understand why. Marcus had prepared an answer. Something about client timing, about deals that fell through, about market conditions. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was the truth. "I don't know. I try. I really do. I start strong, then I just stop. And I don't know why." Diane looked at him for a long moment. "You know, I can't keep someone who's this unpredictable. I don't care about the high months if I can't count on you. I need someone who does 100% consistently, not someone who swings between 180% and 40%. I understand. Fix it, or I'm replacing you. Marcus left the office, drove home, and sat in his apartment staring at his phone. He opened a note app and started typing every explanation he'd ever given himself for why he couldn't maintain consistency. The list was long. He was tired. He needed breaks. He had ADHD, self-diagnosed. He worked better in bursts. He wasn't built for monotony. He needed variety. He was an all-or-nothing personality type. He looked at the list, and something inside him broke, because every single explanation was just a sophisticated story about why he was allowed to be lazy. Every framework he'd adopted was just permission to quit and feel justified about it. That night, Marcus did something unusual. He searched for Miyamoto Musashi. The name had appeared in a podcast he'd half listened to months ago. He found a modern translation of the Book of Five Rings, started reading, and one passage stopped him. In strategy, it is important to see distant things as if they were close, and to take a distanced view of close things. The warrior sees the 1,000-mile path and walks it one step at a time, seeing only the step while knowing the whole journey. Marcus read it 6 times, and slowly, something started to crystallize. Musashi wasn't talking about discipline in the way Marcus had always understood it. He wasn't talking about forcing yourself through discomfort. He was talking about a different relationship with action entirely. The Japanese had a concept for this: Kaizen, continuous improvement, but not in the Western sense of always getting better. In the original samurai context, it meant something more specific, making the smallest possible improvement every single day, with no concern for the cumulative result. The problem with Marcus's approach, and with every productivity system he'd tried, was that it was results-focused. Do X to achieve Y, work hard to close deals, build habits to transform yourself. Every action was justified by the outcome it would produce, and when the outcome didn't appear fast enough, or when the effort felt too great relative to the visible progress, the whole system collapsed. Musashi had discovered something the Western productivity industry completely missed. Action sustained by anticipated results is inherently fragile, because results are unpredictable, delayed, and often outside your control. If your action depends on seeing results, your action will die the moment results disappoint you. But action sustained by Kaizen, by the principle that today's smallest improvement is sufficient unto itself, requiring no justification from future outcomes, that action is indestructible. Because it doesn't depend on anything external, it just is. The improvement today is the entire point. The cumulative effect is irrelevant to whether you do it. Marcus sat with this for 3 days without changing anything. He just observed his own psychology. When he made a sales call, what was he thinking about? The deal, the commission, the quota, the outcome. Every action was a transaction. I do this difficult thing, I get that reward. And the moment the reward seemed distant or unlikely, the action stopped making sense. Why make cold calls if they probably won't convert? Why follow up with that lead if they're probably not ready to buy? Why work on relationships if they might not become customers? His entire relationship with work was transactional, and transactions require both sides to deliver. When the outcome side failed to deliver, when deals didn't close, when effort didn't produce visible results, the transaction broke down, and Marcus stopped acting. Kaizen destroyed that entire framework. It said, make one call better today than yesterday, not to close more deals, to make a better call. That's it. The call itself is the improvement. The outcome is irrelevant to whether the principle was followed. Marcus decided to test it. December 1st. He committed to one thing: make 3 genuine cold calls every morning before 10 a.m. Not calls to hit quota, not calls to close deals, calls to practice being slightly better at calling than he was yesterday. The outcome of the calls was not his concern. Day 1. Marcus sat at his desk at 9 a.m., opened his CRM, selected 3 prospects, made the calls. First one went to voicemail. He left a message that felt awkward. Second one was a brush-off. Third one talked for 6 minutes. expressed mild interest, said to follow up next quarter. In his old framework, this would be a failed morning. No deals advanced, no immediate progress. But under Kaizen, he'd succeeded completely. He'd made 3 calls. Each one was practice. The purpose wasn't to get a yes. The purpose was to make the call. Day 2, same thing, 3 calls, no results, but also no failure. Because there was nothing to fail at. You can't fail at practice. You can only do it or not do it. Day 4. Something strange happened. Marcus noticed he was slightly less anxious during the calls. Not because he'd gotten better at sales, because he'd stopped attaching meaning to the outcome. The calls were just calls, practice reps. Whether the prospect said yes or no had no bearing on whether Marcus had succeeded at his actual purpose, making the calls. Day 7. His manager Diane asked about his activity. "Your call volume's up this week. What changed?" "I'm just making calls." "Okay, but for what purpose?" "To make better calls than yesterday." She looked confused. "I mean, what deals are you advancing?" "I don't know yet. That's not why I'm calling." Diane frowned, clearly unsure if this was brilliance or madness, but his activity numbers were climbing, so she didn't push it. Day 11. Marcus had his first genuine test. A major deal he'd been working for 3 months fell through. Client went with a competitor. In his old pattern, this would trigger a collapse. The disappointment would poison his motivation. He'd spend days spiraling, avoiding work, letting everything else slide while he processed the failure. But this time, something different happened. The next morning at 9 a.m., Marcus sat down and made his 3 calls. Not because he felt like it, not because the deal falling through didn't hurt, but because the practice doesn't depend on whether yesterday's deal closed. The principle is independent of results. The calls felt mechanical. His voice was flat. He had zero enthusiasm. Didn't matter. The practice happened. That's what Kaizen looked like under pressure. Not heroic, not inspired. Just executing the smallest unit of improvement, regardless of external circumstances. Week 3. Marcus's colleague, Derek, cornered him in the break room. "Dude, you're being weird." "How so?" "You're just grinding. Every day, same time, same routine. It's kind of obsessive." "I'm making 3 calls a morning." "Yeah, but like why? You're not even celebrating when deals close. You closed that Hartford account last week, and you just moved on to the next thing. It's like you don't care about winning anymore." Marcus thought about explaining Kaizen, thought about telling Derek that celebrating outcomes reinforces outcome dependency, which creates fragility. That the samurai understood action sustained by intrinsic practice, not extrinsic rewards. But he didn't, because Derek wanted the old Marcus, the guy who had huge wins and huge collapses, the guy who was fun to watch because he was chaotic. This version, steady, mechanical, obsessively consistent, made people uncomfortable. "I care about the practice," Marcus said. Derek shook his head. "That's some monk shit, man." Maybe it was. Marcus couldn't deny the language had shifted. He talked about practice, about improvement independent of results, about doing the work as its own justification. It sounded extreme to people who still operated in the transactional model. But extreme or not, it was working in a way nothing else ever had. Month 2. January. Marcus had made 3 calls every morning for 60 consecutive days. His activity metrics had tripled. But more importantly, something in his psychology had fundamentally shifted. He no longer experienced the emotional volatility that used to define his work life. Wins felt less euphoric. Losses felt less catastrophic. Everything was just practice. His manager pulled him aside. "I don't know what you did, but your numbers are the most consistent I've ever seen from you. You're at 105% 2 months in a row. That's not huge, but it's predictable. And I'll take predictable over your old pattern any day. 3 calls every morning. That's it? That's it." She didn't understand. How could 3 calls create this kind of transformation? But she didn't need to understand. She just needed him to keep doing it. And Marcus would. Not because of her approval, not because of the quota, because the practice didn't require external justification. It justified itself. Month 4. March. Marcus was in the middle of a brutal quarter. Two major deals had stalled. One prospect ghosted him completely, another got acquired, and the whole relationship restarted from zero. In his old pattern, this would be a disaster. He'd be in full collapse mode by now, avoiding the office, spiraling into self-criticism and paralysis. Instead, he sat at his desk at 9 a.m. and made his 3 calls, the same calls he'd been making for 97 consecutive days. Nothing about the external circumstances changed the practice. The practice was immune to circumstances. This is what Musashi had discovered. The warrior whose action depends on favorable conditions is not a warrior. He's an opportunist. Real strength appears when you continue the practice under the worst possible conditions, when everything external suggests stopping, when results have abandoned you, when no one would blame you for taking a break. That's when the practice proves it's a practice, and not just behavior sustained by positive reinforcement. Month 5. Marcus got sick. Real sick. Flu that knocked him flat for a week. Fever, body aches. Couldn't get out of bed for 3 days. On day 4, still weak, still foggy, he dragged himself to his desk at 9 a.m. Made 3 calls. They were terrible calls. His voice was hoarse. His brain was slow. He mixed up names and details. Didn't matter. The practice happened. That's all Kaizen required. Not excellence, not results. Just the smallest unit of improvement attempted. And attempting it while sick was improvement over not attempting it at all. His roommate walked in and found Marcus slumped at his desk afterward. "Dude, you look like death. What are you doing?" "Made my calls." "You should be sleeping." "Probably." "Then why aren't you?" Marcus thought about it. "Because if I skip today, I'm teaching myself that the practice depends on feeling good. And once it depends on that, it's not practice anymore. It's just something I do when conditions are favorable." His roommate looked at him like he'd joined a cult. Maybe he had. The cult of Kaizen. The cult of the smallest daily improvement. The cult of action independent of results. It sounded crazy to people who still lived in the transactional world. But crazy or not, Marcus was experiencing something he'd never experienced before: sustainability. Month 7. Marcus looked at his numbers. He'd hit quota every single month since starting this practice, not by huge margins, but consistently. And consistency, he was learning, was worth more than occasional brilliance. Because brilliant months don't compound. They isolate. They make you look unstable. They make managers nervous. But 7 months of steady performance? That compounds. That builds trust. That creates opportunities. Diane had already promoted him to senior account executive. Not because he'd had a breakout quarter, because he'd proven he was predictable, reliable. Someone who would execute the fundamentals every single day regardless of circumstances. But there was a cost. Marcus had lost something his colleagues valued: his relatability. The old Marcus who swung between highs and lows was fun to grab drinks with. He'd celebrate big wins. He'd commiserate about losses. He'd bond over the shared chaos of sales life. This Marcus, who didn't celebrate wins, who didn't spiral at losses, who just executed his practice with mechanical consistency, made people uncomfortable. Derek stopped inviting him to happy hour. Other colleagues stopped asking about his deals. He'd become too steady, too boring, too much like a monk, as Derek had said. His girlfriend noticed it too. Emily had loved his passion, his intensity, his emotional range. But 7 months of Kaizen had flattened that range considerably. Everything was practice now. Even their relationship felt like something he approached with the same steady, unemotional consistency. "You're different," she said one night over dinner. "I know. You don't seem excited about anything anymore. I'm just less reactive, but you're also less present, like you're always thinking about your practice or your principles or whatever you're doing. And I'm just another thing you're maintaining with discipline." She wasn't wrong. Kaizen had changed his relationship with everything, not just work. Once you understand that outcomes are irrelevant and practice is everything, that lens applies to all of life. And most people don't want to be in a relationship with someone who sees the relationship itself as practice rather than outcome. Emily left 2 weeks later, not dramatically, just quietly realized she wanted someone who still operated in the world of results and emotions and highs and lows. Someone who hadn't been transformed by samurai principles into something steadier but colder. Month 9. Marcus sat in his apartment alone. 9 months of perfect consistency. 9 months of hitting quota. 9 months of practicing the smallest daily improvement. And he realized he'd paid for this transformation with almost every relationship he had. His colleagues found him strange. His ex-girlfriend thought he'd become robotic. His manager appreciated his numbers, but seemed confused by the person producing them. The old Marcus had friends, had excitement, had connection. But the old Marcus also had chaos, had unpredictability, had collapses that destroyed everything he built. And Marcus understood now what Musashi had meant by Dudo, the way of walking alone. The warrior's path is solitary, not because the warrior chooses isolation, but because the warrior's relationship with action is fundamentally different from everyone else's. Most people need social reinforcement, emotional rewards, visible results to sustain their effort. The warrior needs none of that, just the practice, and people find that isolating to be around. Year 1, December 1st, exactly 1 year since Marcus started his practice. He sat at his desk at 9 a.m. and made his 3 calls, call 1096, 1097, and 1098. Each one slightly better than a year ago, not because he'd gotten dramatically more skilled, but because 365 days of deliberate practice creates imperceptible daily improvements that compound into genuine transformation. His manager called him into her office. "I'm making you team lead." "Why?" "Because you're the only person I can count on. Everyone else has good months and bad months. You just have months, steady months. And I need someone who can model that for the rest of the team." Marcus accepted. Not because he wanted the promotion, not because he cared about the title, but because it was what happened when you practiced Kaizen for a year straight. Outcomes showed up, not because you chased them, because they're the natural byproduct of relentless daily improvement. But he wouldn't tell the team about Kaizen, wouldn't explain Musashi's principle, because they'd hear it as productivity advice. They'd try to implement it as a system to achieve results, and they'd miss the entire point. Kaizen only works when you stop caring about what it produces and start caring only about the practice itself. You stop being someone who wants to be consistent and become someone who is consistent. When that happens, people will look at you and think, "He's different." And the answer will be simple. He doesn't do discipline. He practices improvement, the smallest improvement, every single day, independent of how it feels, what it produces, or who's watching. The question remains, are you ready for this level of transformation? Because it's not about becoming more productive. It's not about hitting your goals. This is about fundamentally changing your relationship with action. About practicing improvement as its own justification. About becoming someone who executes the smallest daily practice, regardless of results, feelings, or circumstances. Kaizen won't make you a better person. It'll make you a different person. Someone others will look at and think that's obsessive, or that's too mechanical, or where's the passion? And when you hear those words, you'll know you finally understood what Musashi knew. Action sustained by results is fragile. Action sustained by practice is eternal. You're not trying to become a more productive version of yourself. You're trying to become someone who doesn't need productivity at all. Someone who just practices every day. The smallest improvement, with no concern for where it leads. If this video changed your perspective on what discipline actually requires, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss future content that will transform you. And tell me in the comments, what's the smallest daily practice you'll commit to for the next 30 days? Not to achieve a goal, but purely to practice being slightly better at it each day. Remember, the practice doesn't require justification from results. The practice justifies itself. That's not a technique, that's a completely different way of being human. If you've watched this far, thank you very much for your attention. See you in the next video.